Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. This time we're going to delve into a period of immense change and, well, honestly, some pretty intense clashes. We're talking about modernization and its impact on indigenous peoples, specifically in America and Australia.
A fascinating and complex topic for sure.
It is, it is. We're going to explore how different societies kind of grappled with those forces of modernity and really unpack the consequences, especially for those who are already here, long before European arrival.
You've hit on something really crucial there. I mean, modernization, it wasn't a uniform experience at all. Each society, they kind of navigated it in their own way, right? And that led to, well, it led to some fascinating variations and unexpected outcomes, I think.
Yeah, like I think we often have this image of modernization as this sort of like one-way march of progress, right? But it's clearly much more complex than that.
Oh, absolutely.
So where do we even begin to sort of unravel this tangled web?
Well, I think a good place to start would be with those two major forces that really kind of propelled modernization, the Industrial Revolution, and the rise of those political revolutions that were advocating for popular sovereignty.
Okay, so those are two massive topics right there. On the one hand, you've got like this explosion of technological innovation.
Right.
And on the other, you have these really radical shifts in how people thought about power and governance.
Exactly. And these two forces, they were deeply intertwined. I mean, think about it. The Industrial Revolution, it created new economic realities, new social tensions, right? And those, in many ways, fueled those calls for political change.
Yeah, it's like a feedback loop almost. Okay, so let's dive into the Industrial Revolution first. It seems like, every nation had its own unique experience with industrialization. Like it wasn't just a copy-paste situation.
Not at all. It wasn't a single blueprint, that's for sure. I mean, take Britain, for example. They focused really heavily on coal and textiles early on. And then later, of course, you had that boom in railway construction. And, those industries really shaped the landscape of their industrialization, the way it unfolded.
And those, like, early choices they made, those had a ripple effect, right? I mean, isn't Britain's experience kind of heavily influence other nations like the U.S. and Germany?
You're absolutely right. Both the U.S. and Germany, they kind of, to some extent, followed a similar trajectory, although, of course, they each, adapted it to their own specific context. But then you look at Russia, for instance,
Right.
and you see a completely different model. I mean, their industrialization, it happened much later, and they focused on things like heavy industry and railways right from the start.
Oh, interesting. So they sort of skipped a step, jumping straight into like large-scale industrialization.
Yeah, you could say that.
That's fascinating. But I imagine all of this rapid change, it came with a cost, right? Both socially and environmentally.
Oh, absolutely. You're raising a really critical point there. I mean, the human and environmental costs of industrialization were undeniable. I mean, you just have to, look at Britain again, right? They experienced this incredible economic growth, but it came at the expense of their working class, who faced, really harsh working conditions, low wages, and severe pollution.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder, I think, that progress isn't always evenly distributed.
Right.
Okay, so we've got these nations forging their own paths to industrialization. But how did these changes, how did they sort of intertwine with the rise of nationalisms, right? Because those were kind of brewing at the same time.
Oh, absolutely. Nationalisms, they emerged as this incredibly potent force, really, alongside industrialization. And the two were inseparable. I mean, you really can't understand one without considering the other.
Yeah. And these nationalisms, they're all about, like, popular sovereignty, right? The idea that power should reside with the people.
Exactly.
But as you mentioned earlier, even within that concept, there were different, like, flavors of nationalism.
Precisely. You had what's called civic nationalism, which, well, it really championed this idea of granting sovereignty to all citizens equally, regardless of their background, their ethnicity, their religion.
Okay.
Think of it as like a nation built on shared rights and citizenship, not necessarily on shared ancestry or beliefs.
Okay, yeah, that sounds pretty inclusive, at least on the surface.
It aimed to be. It aimed to be. But then, of course, you had ethnic religious nationalisms, which took a very different approach.
Right.
They emphasized shared heritage, a specific language, religion, or set of traditions as the defining characteristic of the nation.
So one focuses on shared values, while the other focuses on shared heritage.
Yeah, exactly.
And those differences, I mean, they had like real-world consequences, right?
Absolutely. These different ideologies, they played out in some fascinating ways across the globe. For instance, if you look at most Western countries today, they define their national identity based on shared citizenship,
Right.
which, aligns more with those ideals of civic nationalism.
Yeah.
But of course, there are exceptions. Germany, for example, has this long and complicated history with ethnic nationalism.
Which is kind of ironic considering that they are considered part of the Western world, right?
Right.
It just shows how messy these categories can be.
Absolutely.
And I imagine places like India, China, and even Japan, they grappled with these competing ideas of nationalism as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. Those countries, they offer really compelling case studies. Japan, for example, is a remarkable case. They managed to avoid pollinization altogether, and they achieved this incredibly rapid economic development in the 20th century.
Wow. Yeah, that's impressive, especially given like the geopolitical landscape at the time.
It is.
What fueled their success?
Well, they strategically adopted aspects of Western modernization while also preserving key elements of their own culture. And it's not just, a post-World War II phenomenon. Their groundwork was laid much earlier. Did you know that by 1910, Japan had essentially achieved universal primary school enrollment and eliminated tuition fees?
Whoa. I have no idea they were that progressive that early on. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's a fascinating aspect of their history that often gets overlooked. But, it's not to say their path was without its challenges. Japan also faced those internal tensions between democracy and militarism, and between traditional values and West influences.
Yeah, it sounds like a period of immense dynamism, right, where they were constantly sort of negotiating between these different ideologies and forces.
Exactly.
And speaking of negotiating different forces, what about China? I mean, they had a vastly different experience, right?
Oh, indeed. China's path was, well, it was marked by resistance to colonial exploitation. I mean, they faced peasant rebellions, undertook various reforms, and ultimately went through a revolution. And the Chinese Communist Party, drawing strength from the rural population and focusing on, social change and equality, they ultimately rose to power in 1949.
So while Japan sort of embraced this rapid modernization, China took a more like revolutionary route.
Yeah, you could say that. And since then, they've been working to find, this balance between their political framework and economic growth. It's been a complex undertaking, and it really highlights how, there wasn't a single path to modernity, right? Each nation had to grapple with its own unique set of circumstances and challenges.
So we've got like these different versions of modernity sort of emerging across the globe. But it's impossible to ignore that darker side of this whole story, right? Especially especially when we consider the impact on indigenous populations in places like, North America and Australia.
You're absolutely right. I mean, we can't talk about modernization without acknowledging those devastating consequences for indigenous communities. As European empires expanded, driven by this pursuit of profit and power, they really left a trail of displacement and dispossession, I'd say, in their wake.
Yeah, it's a tragic chapter in human history for sure. And to really understand it, I think we need to kind of unpack this concept of settler colonies, right? It seems like that term gets thrown around a lot, but what does it really mean in this context?
Well, think of it this way. Settler colonies, they weren't just about, establishing a temporary presence for trade or resource extraction. They were about permanently displacing the native populations and replacing them with European settlers. It was a land grab, really, on a massive scale, and often, justified by these deeply flawed ideologies.
And I'm guessing those motivations for colonization, they weren't always like the same across the board, right? I mean, you had everything from like trading companies in South Asia focused solely on profit to waves of European settlers, flocking to the Americas and Australia seeking new lives.
Exactly. The context definitely varied, but that underlying goal was often the same. To claim land and resources, often, at the expense of those who were already there. And one of the tools they often used was this idea of terra nullius, meaning, land belonging to no one. They used that to try to legitimize their actions.
It's mind-boggling how they could just like ignore the fact that these lands were already inhabited by these vibrant cultures with deep connections to their homelands. It's like they were willfully blind to the reality in front of them.
And that blindness, or perhaps, deliberate erasure, it extended to indigenous names and identities as well. Think about how many places in the Americas and Australia have names that start with New Zealand, New South Wales, New England, right? It's a stark reminder of how, European settlers, they imposed their own worldview and often, I'd say, obliterated those original names and histories.
It's like they were trying to create like a new world in their own image, completely disregarding what was already there.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of European expansion and the establishment of these settler colonies. Let's zoom in on North America specifically for a moment. What was the situation like for indigenous communities there before European arrival?
North America was incredibly diverse. I mean, it wasn't a monolithic entity by any means. You had this vast array of Native American tribes, each with their own unique traditions, languages, and relationships with the natural world. They had complex societies, sophisticated agricultural practices, and a deep, deep understanding of their environments.
And it's such a tragedy that so much of that diversity was lost, right?
It is.
I actually came across a story about the Hopi tribe that I think really highlights the clash of perceptions that happened during those initial encounters between Europeans and Native Americans. Have you heard this one?
I'm all ears.
Okay, so the Hopi, they have this story about how they were, expecting the arrival of their brothers and sisters from across the land. And they believed these individuals would arrive as turtles, symbolizing like their slow and steady journey.
Turtles as a symbol of arrival. That's an interesting choice. What's the significance there?
Well, for the Hopi, turtles, they represent wisdom, longevity, and this deep connection to the earth. And so they saw the arrival of these turtle people, as a positive event, a time of sharing and learning.
So when the Spanish conquistadors arrived, clad in armor, the Hopi, they thought.
They thought, aha, these must be the turtle people. We've been waiting for them. They saw the conquistadors' armor as turtle shells.
Whoa, talk about a misinterpretation, right?
Right. And instead of the warm welcome they were expecting, the Spanish just dropped trinkets into their outstretched hands. It was just this huge misconnection fueled by these completely different worldviews and expectations.
That story really, I think, speaks volumes about those challenges of cross-cultural communication, especially when you have, such vastly different ways of understanding the world.
And unfortunately, those miscommunications they often turned violent, right? As European settlements expanded, they encroached further and further onto Native American lands, leading to conflict and displacement.
Sadly, you're right. And one of those, key points of contention was this whole concept of land ownership. The Native Americans, they didn't believe in owning the land the way that Europeans did. They saw themselves as stewards of the land, responsible for its well-being.
Which makes figures like Thomas Jefferson all the more perplexing. I mean, he literally dreamed of a nation dominated by European-style farms, completely disregarding those existing ways of life.
Jefferson, he really does represent this collision of worldviews. He and many others, they believed in the superiority of European agricultural practices, and they saw Native American land use as unproductive, right? And that kind of thinking, it fueled that westward expansion and the displacement of countless tribes.
And as they pushed westward, they forced Native American tribes into signing these treaties, right? That ceded like huge chunks of their territory.
Yes, and those treaties, they were often riddled with deception and coercion. The prices they paid were usually paltry, and there were, numerous instances of outright fraud. I mean, the Native Americans were often pressured or tricked into signing away their ancestral lands.
It's a shameful chapter in American history for sure. And it wasn't just about like the land itself. These forced removals, they disrupted, Native American cultures, traditions, ways of life. And perhaps one of the most horrifying examples of this is the Trail of Tears.
Absolutely. The Trail of Tears, I mean, the forced relocation of the Cherokee Nation from their ancestral lands in the southeastern U.S. to present-day Oklahoma. It's just a heartbreaking testament to the brutality of this era. Thousands of Cherokee people were forced to march westward, and it resulted in countless deaths along the way, due to disease, starvation, and exhaustion.
It's horrifying. And what makes it even more tragic is that it was a direct violation of their rights, right? I mean, the Cherokee Nation had been recognized as a sovereign entity with the highest court in the land, affirming their territorial rights.
You're referring to the 1832 Supreme Court ruling by Chief Justice John Marshall, right?
Exactly. He ruled that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community with its own territory, where the laws of the state of Georgia had no force. They should have been protected.
They should have. They absolutely should have. But President Andrew Jackson, despite, his populist image, he refused to enforce the court's decision. He defied the Supreme Court, ordered the U.S. Army to remove the Cherokee people from their land and relocate them to what was then considered, undesirable territory.
It's astounding that a president could just, ignore the rule of law like that. What were the justifications for these actions? How could they possibly defend such blatant disregard for Native American rights?
Well, a common argument was that, the Native Americans weren't using the land productively in the eyes of European settlers, right? They didn't believe in private property or intensive agriculture, which were, so central to the European concept of civilization.
So their way of life, their deep connection to the land, it was used against them.
Exactly. They were deemed, uncivilized because their values and practices differed from those of the dominant European culture. And tragically, as the demand for land intensified, fueled by things like the gold rush, railway construction, and, the influx of European immigrants seeking land and opportunity, the pressure on Native American tribes, it just grew.
And it wasn't just in North America, right? I mean, Australia has a similar story of colonization and its devastating impact on indigenous populations there.
You're right to draw that parallel. I mean, Australia's Aboriginal peoples have endured centuries of oppression, displacement, and cultural erasure. And their experiences, while distinct, they share many common themes with those of Native Americans.
So let's talk about Australia then. Can you tell us a bit about the history of Aboriginal peoples and their encounter with European colonization?
Aboriginal Australians, they've inhabited the continent for tens of thousands of years, making them one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. And their traditions, their languages, their spiritual beliefs, they're deeply intertwined with the land. And this concept of dream time is central to their worldview.
Dream time. That sounds fascinating. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
It's a complex concept, really. It encompasses their creation stories, their understanding of the natural world, their spiritual connection to their ancestral lands. It's a way of understanding the past, present, and future as interconnected.
It's like a living history, like woven into the very fabric of their culture.
You could say that. And it's crucial to understand that within this broader category of Aboriginal, there are numerous distinct groups, each with their own unique language and cultural practices. The Torres Strait Islanders, for example, they have a distinct identity and history.
So we're talking about like a vast tapestry of cultures, just like in North America. And tragically, their encounter with European colonization, it followed a similar pattern of displacement and dispossession.
Unfortunately, yes. When the British arrived in Australia in the late 18th century, they initially established a penal colony.
A penal colony. So they were sending like convicts there.
Exactly. Many of those early settlers were convicts deported from Britain, and once their sentences were served, they were often, granted land, which they claimed with little regard for the Aboriginal peoples who already lived there.
So you have these convicts arriving, often, desperate for a fresh start and claiming land that wasn't theirs to claim. It sounds like a recipe for conflict.
It was. I mean, clashes were inevitable as Aboriginal Australians resisted the encroachment on their lands and the disruption of their traditional ways of life. And as in North America, the introduction of European diseases had a devastating impact on Indigenous populations, further weakening their ability to resist colonization.
It's heartbreaking to think about those ripple effects of these diseases, right? I mean, it wasn't just about like physical illness, it was about the loss of knowledge, traditions, entire communities.
You're right to point that out. I mean, the impact went far beyond just, immediate mortality rates. It disrupted social structures, spiritual practices, the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next.
And on top of that, the Australian government, for a significant part of its history, they actively pursued this policy of assimilation, right? Attempting to force Aboriginal people to abandon their cultures and adopt European ways of life.
That's right. The assimilation policy was a deeply misguided attempt to eradicate Aboriginal cultures and integrate them into white Australian society. Children were forcibly removed from in their families and placed in institutions. And they were often forbidden from speaking their native languages or practicing their traditions. It was a systematic effort really to erase their cultural heritage.
It's hard to imagine the trauma that must have inflicted on generations of Aboriginal Australians, right? To lose your land, your language, your family, your very identity. It's a wound that cuts deep.
It's a profound and lasting trauma for sure. The psychological and social consequences of these policies, they continue to affect Aboriginal communities today.
So we've seen how modernization, with its emphasis on industrialization, expansion, and European dominance, led to the displacement and dispossession of indigenous peoples in both North America and Australia. Are there any glimmers of hope in this story? Were there any efforts to acknowledge the injustices that were done and to try to right those wrongs? It's remarkable how, despite these horrific injustices, indigenous cultures have not only like survived but continue to thrive.
It really is. It speaks to their strength and resilience, doesn't it? I mean, imagine colonization, forced assimilation, the loss of so much, and yet their traditions, their languages, their connection to their homelands, it persists.
But that persistence has come at a cost, right? What are some of the challenges that indigenous communities still face today?
Well, I mean, think about the ripple effects of centuries of dispossession, right? Many indigenous communities, they struggle with poverty, limited access to healthcare and education, and the ongoing loss of their lands and resources. They face discrimination, systemic racism, and are often excluded from decisions that directly affect their lives.
It's like those colonial power structures are still casting a long shadow even today.
That's a powerful way to put it, and that's why it's so crucial to move beyond simply, acknowledging past wrongs. We need to work towards, dismantling those structures and creating a more just and equitable future for Indigenous peoples.
What does that work look like? I mean, where are we seeing like positive change happening?
There are so many inspiring initiatives underway. Indigenous communities, they're leading the charge really in revitalizing their languages and cultures, reclaiming their traditional knowledge and advocating for their rights. They're working to heal from the trauma of the past and build a brighter future for their children.
Like they're drawing on that incredible resilience we talked about, to create positive change.
Exactly. They are not simply victims of history. They are active agents shaping their own destinies. And there's a growing recognition that their knowledge and perspectives are essential really for tackling some of the world's biggest challenges like climate change and environmental degradation.
Yeah, it seems like we have so much to learn from them, especially when it comes to like living sustainably and in harmony with nature.
Absolutely. Their traditional knowledge systems, they hold valuable insights into environmental stewardship, resource management, and community resilience that we we would be wise to heed.
So what can we as individuals do to be part of this positive change? I mean, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of these issues, but I imagine there are things we can do in our own communities.
You're right. It can feel daunting, but even, small actions, they can make a difference. Start by educating yourself. Learn about the history and cultures of indigenous peoples in your area. Listen to their story, amplify their voices, and learn from their wisdom.
So it's about like moving beyond the textbooks and engaging with indigenous communities directly.
Exactly. Support, indigenous artists, writers, and activists. Explore the issues that affect them in your local area. Advocate for policies that promote their rights and well-being. Remember, this isn't just, their history. It's our shared history, and the consequences they continue to shape our world today.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. I'm inspired by the resilience of indigenous cultures and motivated to learn more about the history and challenges in my own region. What about you? What resonates with you most from our conversation?
For me, it's the reminder that even in the face of immense adversity, hope and resilience can flourish. Indigenous communities are not just surviving, they are thriving. They're reclaiming their heritage and forging new paths forward. It's a powerful testament to the human spirit, I think.
That's a powerful note to end on. Thanks for guiding us through this incredible deep dive. It's been eye-opening and inspiring.
It's been my pleasure, and I encourage all of you listening to continue exploring this topic on your own. There's so much more to discover, and each story we learn helps us to better understand the complexities of our world. Who knows? Maybe you'll even be inspired to take action in your own community.
And for those of you who want to learn more, we've got a few links and resources in the show note. Until next time, keep diving deep.